The skies over Germany in 1944 were no longer a stage for victory. They had become a heavy lid of lead, hanging low above burning factories, oil-stained runways, and cities torn apart block by daily bombing raids. In that moment, Nazi Germany unveiled something that stunned the world: the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational jet fighter in history, faster than anything flying over Europe, armed with firepower capable of tearing through bomber formations in seconds. And yet the question remains cold and unavoidable. Why did a machine so far ahead of its time fail to save the Luftwaffe? Why did this technological leap arrive when everything beneath it was already collapsing? Fuel running dry, pilots lacking flight hours, factories shattered, and orders from the top shifting with impulse rather than strategy? This is not a story about a wonder weapon. This is the story of the death of the Luftwaffe, a force that once ruled the skies and then wrote its own epitaph at the very moment it touched the future. The sky does not collapse in a single day. The fall of the Luftwaffe did not begin with American bombs, nor with the dense formations of B-17 crossing German airspace in 1944. It began much earlier, more quietly and far more dangerously. It began with how Germany understood air war itself. After the First World War, Germany was stripped of its right to maintain a military air force. The Treaty of Versailles did not merely confiscate aircraft. It attempted to erase memory, the memory of German air power. But prohibition rarely destroys ambition. It buries it. And in the 1920s, German officers did not forget. They waited. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, air power was no longer optional. It was inevitable. For the Nazi regime, the future war had to be fast, decisive, and overwhelming. And no instrument suited that vision better than a powerful air force, flexible, aggressive, and capable of striking first. In 1935, the Luftwaffe was officially born. The man placed in charge was not an engineer, not a long-term strategist, but Hermann Göring, a First World War flying ace, a propaganda symbol, and a political figure driven by ambition as much as by doctrine. From its first breath, the Luftwaffe carried a contradiction: a modern air force built upon an old understanding of war. In its early years, the Luftwaffe expanded at an astonishing pace. Germany possessed every apparent advantage: a world-class aviation industry, brilliant engineers bearing names like Messerschmitt, Heinkel, Junkers, Dornier, and Focke-Wulf, a technically educated population, and above all, unwavering political commitment. By 1938, German aircraft production exceeded 5,000 machines. By 1939, it surpassed 8,000. On paper, the Luftwaffe was formidable. The Bf-109 dominated as a frontline fighter. The Ju-87 Stuka terrorized enemies with precision dive bombing. The He-111 and Do-17 formed the backbone of tactical bombing. The Ju-52 transported troops and supplies, extending the reach of German operations. But all of these aircraft served one type of war: a short war, a tactical war, a war meant to shatter armies before economies could respond. The Luftwaffe was never built to dismantle an industrial system. It was built to break an enemy in weeks. This distinction would define everything that followed. One man inside the Luftwaffe understood the danger. His name was Walter Wever. Wever was no dreamer. He recognized that modern war would be total war, a struggle in which factories, railways, resources, and civilian morale mattered as much as frontline victories. He argued that Germany could not defeat an industrial power without striking at its industrial heart. Wever championed the idea of a long-range strategic bomber force. If Germany ever fought the Soviet Union or another industrial giant, victory would depend on destroying production at its source. This concept became known as the Ural bomber. Two prototypes emerged: the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89. They were ambitious but insufficient. They lacked range. They lacked payload. And they could not match aircraft already under development elsewhere, such as the American B-17. In 1936, Walter Wever was killed in an aircraft accident. With him died Germany's embryonic doctrine of strategic air warfare. Göring and Hitler chose another path: fast campaigns, tactical dominance, no heavy bomber fleet. At the time, the decision appeared rational. Germany lacked aluminum, rubber, fuel. Strategic bombers demanded resources the economy could not sustain indefinitely. But the price was enormous. Germany forfeited the ability to fight a prolonged air war. From 1939 to 1940, reality seemed to confirm Göring's vision. Poland collapsed, Norway fell. The Low Countries were overrun. France surrendered in 6 weeks. The Luftwaffe performed with brutal efficiency. It coordinated seamlessly with ground forces. It dominated tactical and operational levels of war. This was the Luftwaffe at its peak, not because it possessed superior technology, but because the war unfolded exactly as it had been designed to fight it. And therein lay the trap. Victory bred certainty. Certainty bred arrogance. The Luftwaffe assumed wars would always be short. Enemies would crumble before adaptation. Strategic restructuring would never be required. They were wrong. After the fall of France, only Britain remained between Germany and continental dominance. Operation Sea Lion was conceived. Its prerequisite was absolute air superiority. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced a prolonged air battle against an organized opponent, one equipped with radar, protected by geography, and sustained by secure industry. Here, the Luftwaffe's limitations became unmistakable. It lacked strategic bombers. It lacked the capacity to cripple British infrastructure permanently. Targets shifted erratically, momentum dissolved. The Battle of Britain did not destroy the Luftwaffe, but it shattered its aura of inevitability. One of the Luftwaffe's most damaging weaknesses lay beyond the sky, in its rivalry with the German Navy. Göring famously declared, "Everything that flies belongs to me." He resisted any attempt to create an independent naval air arm. The consequences were severe. U-boats received minimal aerial coordination. The FW-200 Condor, despite its effectiveness, was underutilized. The Battle of the Atlantic was never fully exploited. With only a handful of Condors, German forces sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping. The potential impact of coordinated air-naval warfare was immense. It was never realized. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This war was different. Distances were vast. Time stretched endlessly. Industry retreated eastward. Attrition replaced shock. The Luftwaffe was unprepared. Damaged aircraft had to be sent back to Germany for repair. Forward airfields were inadequate. Supply chains fractured. By late 1941, fewer than 30% of Luftwaffe airfields in the east were fully operational. This was no longer a tactical failure. It was a structural collapse. After 1942, air war transformed. This was no longer pilot against pilot. It was industry against industry. The United States produced aircraft in staggering numbers. Britain adapted relentlessly. The Soviet Union moved factories beyond reach. Germany did not. The Luftwaffe became trapped in chaotic procurement, political interference, absence of long-term planning. By the time revolutionary aircraft appeared, the foundation beneath them had already rotted. There was no single day when the Luftwaffe fell, no final dogfight that ended it, no decisive aerial battle marked on a map. Instead, the Luftwaffe descended slowly, like an aircraft landing with engines already failing, knowing the flight would never resume. The turning point did not arrive with a new Allied invention. It arrived when the nature of the war itself changed. For the first 2 years of the war, the Luftwaffe was always the attacker. It chose the time. It chose the place. It dictated the tempo. After 1941, that era ended. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was forced to defend its own skies. British bombers began striking German cities at night. Inaccurate, but relentless. Aimed not only at factories, but at morale, housing, and the rhythm of civilian life. Germany had never prepared for this. There was no fully integrated air defense doctrine. Radar, fighter control, and anti-aircraft guns were fragmented. There was no force designed specifically for sustained high-altitude interception. The Luftwaffe was reacting, and reaction is always the weaker position. By 1942, RAF night bombing had evolved into a campaign of attrition, not to destroy Germany overnight, but to force it to bleed resources endlessly. Every night brought alarms. Every night halted production. Every night disrupted sleep, transport, and labor. The Luftwaffe was compelled to keep fighters at home instead of the front, disperse limited forces, accept losses that achieved no decisive outcome. This was a form of warfare the Luftwaffe had never learned to win. The year 1943 marked the true shift, not because of one defeat, but because the Allies completed their system. American bombers now flew by day, in tight formations, with heavy defensive fire, and increasingly with long-range fighter escort. This was the scenario the Luftwaffe could not endure. The B-17s and B-24s did not need to destroy the Luftwaffe in one battle. They only needed to force it into the air every day. And every scramble meant wear. Every interception meant attrition. Every loss was irreplaceable. Aircraft could be built. Pilots could not. This was where the Luftwaffe began to lose the war irreversibly. Its experienced pilots, veterans of France, Britain, North Africa, and the Eastern Front, were steadily ground down. Each interception meant flying into dense defensive fire, engaging superior numbers, facing well-escorted formations. There was no rotation system, no meaningful rest, no strategic conservation of experience. The Luftwaffe fought every battle as if it were the last, and by doing so, it lost the men it needed to survive the next one. During its early victories, the Luftwaffe cut training. It was a decision born of confidence, and it became catastrophic. Before the war, German pilots averaged around 250 flight hours. By 1942, that number fell below 200. By 1944, many pilots entered combat with barely 100 hours. In contrast, American pilots trained with over 300 hours. They trained in safety. They trained continuously. This gap could never be closed. The Luftwaffe was no longer losing aircraft. It was losing human quality. When the United States fully mobilized, the war entered a new phase. America did not need quick victory. It needed output. By 1944, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft, roughly one every 5 minutes. Germany could not match this. It lacked aluminum. It lacked fuel. Its factories were bombed repeatedly. Its skilled labor was shrinking. The Luftwaffe was not defeated by a superior aircraft. It was defeated by industrial mathematics. One of the Luftwaffe's most fatal weaknesses lay in procurement. There was no stable plan, no consistent standard. Aircraft were designed, tested, altered by political order, rushed into production, then redesigned again. The result was delay, waste, and inefficiency. Germany produced many aircraft types, but few truly mature ones. In 1936, Ernst Udet took control of Luftwaffe technical development. Udet was a hero of the First World War, but he was not a systems architect. He favored dive bombing, dramatic concepts, personal intuition. He avoided hard eliminations. Under his leadership, Heinkel 177 became a disaster. Me 210 failed catastrophically. Resources were drained into impractical projects. The Luftwaffe lost its technical compass. Before, the Luftwaffe dictated events. Now it reacted. Bombs fell, fighters scrambled, factories burned, production shifted. Pilots died, less trained men replaced them. There was no longer a strategy, only reflex. This was the moment the Luftwaffe truly touched the ground. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe still possessed thousands of aircraft on paper. But reality told another story. Fuel shortages crippled training. Spare parts were scarce. Experienced pilots were gone. The Luftwaffe still flew, but it no longer shaped the war. Everything that followed was consequence. By the time aircraft like the Me-262 neared readiness, the Luftwaffe had already lost the strategic contest. The turning point was not in the future. It had already passed. If Part 2 marked the moment the Luftwaffe lost the sky, then Part 3 is where it lost itself. The destruction of the Luftwaffe did not come solely from Allied bombs or overwhelming numbers. It came from inside, from conference rooms and command chains, from distorted production lines, from political interference, and from leaders no longer capable of managing a war that had outgrown their understanding. This was the phase in which the Luftwaffe entered its own internal hell. The Luftwaffe was never a purely military institution. From its birth, it was a political instrument, a symbol, a propaganda showcase, a stage for personal power. Hermann Göring was not merely commander-in-chief of the Air Force. He was Hitler's confidant, a political actor, a man whose authority depended on spectacle and success. The consequence was fatal. Technical decisions became political decisions. Aircraft were no longer chosen because they fit the battlefield. They were chosen because they pleased those above. No major Luftwaffe project was immune to Hitler's personal intervention. A design could make sense on an engineer's table. It could be validated by testing, and then be altered completely after a single briefing. Hitler distrusted what he did not understand, favored what sounded decisive, interfered relentlessly in technical detail. The results were predictable. Constant design changes, shortened testing cycles. Production before maturity. The Luftwaffe no longer functioned as a modern air force. It functioned as a laboratory forced into combat. Ernst Udet was not incompetent. He was brave, a gifted pilot, a charismatic figure. But he was given a task beyond his ability to direct the technical future of the Luftwaffe. Udet loved dive bombing, daring ideas, dramatic innovation. He was ill-suited for system management, long-term planning, ruthless prioritization. Under his leadership, the Luftwaffe pursued too many projects at once, failed to cancel flawed designs early, drained resources into impractical concepts. This was not chaos by accident. It was chaos by structure. No aircraft better illustrates this failure than the Heinkel 177. It was intended to be Germany's first true four-engine heavy bomber, the aircraft Walter Weber had envisioned years earlier. But Udet demanded something irrational. It had to be capable of dive bombing. To fulfill this requirement, the design was contorted. Engines paired into shared nacelles. Heat buildup became extreme. Engine fires were constant. Development delays multiplied. The HE-177 became unreliable, dangerous, strategically irrelevant. This was not merely an aircraft failure. It was a failure of leadership logic. The Messerschmitt Me 210 was meant to replace the Me 110. Instead, it became another warning ignored. It was ordered into mass production before stability issues were resolved, before flight characteristics were understood, before testing was complete. The outcome was predictable: accidents, poor performance, costly conversions into the Me 410. The pattern was clear: build first, fix later, pay in blood. When the Me 262 finally emerged, it did not enter a strong Luftwaffe. It entered an organization already exhausted. Technically, the Me 262 was revolutionary: unmatched speed, devastating firepower, advanced aerodynamics. Systemically, it faced every possible obstacle: bureaucratic delay, political interference, shifting priorities. The Me 262 was born not into opportunity, but into administrative paralysis. As a pure interceptor, the Me 262 was ideal. But Hitler wanted more. He wanted bombs, ground attack, a decisive weapon. This decision delayed deployment, altered training, diluted mission focus. At the moment German skies needed interceptors, the Me 262 was diverted into unsuitable roles. This was not tactical confusion. It was strategic blindness. Flying the Me 262 was not like flying piston aircraft. Jet engines were sensitive, slow to respond, unforgiving of error. Yet the Luftwaffe no longer had time. Pilots were sent into combat with shortened training, minimal jet experience, scarce fuel hours. Many had never accumulated enough flight time to master the aircraft, understand its limits, recover from failures. The Me 262 demanded excellence. The system could no longer provide it. German jet engines were advanced in concept, but Germany lacked heat-resistant alloys. The result: extremely short engine lifespan, constant replacement needs, low operational reliability. Under wartime conditions, bombed factories. scarce spare parts, and inadequate maintenance. The Me-262 became fast, lethal, fragile. The future was shackled by present scarcity. Inside the Luftwaffe, morale collapsed alongside logistics. Pilots knew they were losing. Engineers knew time had run out. Officers knew orders lacked coherence. Each day meant fewer aircraft, less fuel, fewer comrades returning. Illusions vanished. Only obligation remained. The Luftwaffe's hell was not always combat. It was found in endless meetings, designs endlessly revised, missions known to be unequal. The Me-262 streaked across the sky like lightning, but on the ground everything was collapsing. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe possessed the Me-262, the WW2 the Me-163, the Do-335. Yet it lacked fuel, trained pilots, a functioning system. Technology could not save an institution already hollow. Wars rarely end with a single dramatic collapse. They end through exhaustion. For the Luftwaffe, the final months of the Second World War were not defined by one decisive battle, but by a repeating cycle of scarcity, desperation, and missions launched with the knowledge that survival was no longer a strategic expectation. As Allied armies closed in from both east and west, the sky ceased to be a domain of maneuver. It became a place of judgment. At the beginning of 1944, the Luftwaffe still existed on paper. Aircraft inventories listed thousands of machines. Technical drawings promised revolutionary designs. Names like the Me-262, WW2 Me-163, and Do-335 filled reports and briefings. Reality on the runways told another story. Fuel allocations were slashed to the point that training virtually ceased. New pilots were sent directly into combat. Factories were bombed, dispersed, and forced underground. Command chains fractured under pressure. The Luftwaffe was no longer a coherent air force. It had become a collection of desperate efforts. The Messerschmitt Me 262 began appearing in meaningful numbers over Germany by mid-1944. Technically, it remained astonishing. Faster than any Allied fighter, armed with firepower capable of shredding bomber formations in seconds, aerodynamically years ahead of its time. When a Me-262 closed on a formation of B-17S or Lancasters, it did not turn, climb, or circle. It struck, fired, and vanished. For brief moments, the Luftwaffe felt control again. Those moments did not last. The Me-262 did not fail because of speed or firepower. It failed because of the conditions in which it existed. Jet engines required refined fuel, heat-resistant alloys, constant maintenance. Germany no longer possessed these in sufficient quantity. Engine service life was often measured in mere dozens of hours, in many cases far less. Each sortie became a calculated risk. Allied forces recognized this quickly. They did not chase the Me-262 in level flight. They waited for it to take off and to land. The Me-262 was fastest when airborne at speed. It was most vulnerable at its slowest moments. During takeoff and landing, engines were unstable. Acceleration was limited. Escape was impossible. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts were assigned to hunt precisely these moments. Many Me-262s were destroyed. Moments after leaving the runway. Seconds before touchdown. When power could not be increased in time. The irony was brutal. The fastest aircraft of the war was most vulnerable when it was slow. The pilots who flew the Me-262 were not cowards, and they understood they were flying the future of aviation. They also understood they were outnumbered, undersupplied, unsupported by strategy. Many flew with the clear knowledge that survival today did not imply survival tomorrow. Combat motivation was no longer belief in victory. It was personal duty inside a collapsing system. The Me-262 was not alone. The WW2 the world's first operational jet bomber. The Me-163, a rocket-powered interceptor. The Do-335, the fastest piston-engine aircraft of the war. Each was brilliant in design. Each arrived too late. None could be produced, trained for, or integrated at scale. They did not fail individually. They failed together for the same reason. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had lost all meaningful control of German airspace. Bombing raids went unchallenged. Railways collapsed. Industry ground to a halt. The remaining airfields suffered from fuel shortages, lack of spare parts, absence of trained personnel. Many squadrons existed only on paper. Me-262S still took off. Each takeoff resembled a farewell. Unlike popular myths of war, the Luftwaffe did not end in one final clash. There was no day when the skies suddenly fell silent. There were only days with fewer aircraft, fewer pilots returning, less hope. The war ended through depletion, not through a single blow. When Allied engineers examined the Me-262, they were stunned. They saw advanced aerodynamic thinking, correct jet engine concepts, ideas far ahead of their time. They also saw fragile engines, incomplete systems, distorted development processes. The Me-262 was not a technological failure. It was a technical success inside a strategic failure. The Luftwaffe did not collapse from lack of creativity. It collapsed because it failed to understand long war, build sustainable production, preserve human capital, separate politics from engineering. The Me-262 proved one final truth. Technology cannot save a flawed strategy. The Me-262 represented the future of air warfare. But the future requires time, systems, trained people, strategic discipline. By the time the Me-262 was ready, the Luftwaffe had lost all of these. And so the future took flight over ruins. The Luftwaffe once ruled the skies of Europe. It was not defeated in a single climactic battle. It dissolved decision by decision. The Me-262 flew faster than anything else in the war, but it could not fly backward through time. That was the Luftwaffe's final sentence.